Hey, this is Warren. I'm back with some more fairy tales from the trusty book of the original tales of Brothers Grimm. Today we're going to be talking about Sleeping Beauty. And I want you to notice that throughout fairy tales, there are a couple common themes. One is hunger, lack of food. Another is infertility. And I want you to think back about how life is think back on life today. What do people lack? Do they still lack food? Are there people who have infertility problems? Yes. And that's how it was hundreds of years ago as well. Let's get to it. By the way, in the Grimm's fairy tales, it's called The Sleeping Beauty. And there's a tradition in Western culture that teaches, it's a part of the misogynistic, the hatred of women tradition, where women look most beautiful when they're either dead or asleep. All right? In times past, there lived a king and a queen who said to each other every day of their lives, "Would that we had a child." So these people have been married and they want to have children. And yet, they had none. But it happened once that when the queen was bathing, there came a frog out of the water. A frog, yes, a frog, not Kermit, okay? He squatted on the ground and said to her, "Thy wish shall be fulfilled. Before a year has gone by, thou shalt bring a daughter into the world." Do you hear the echo of the Ten Commandments? Thou shalt. But never was there a Ten Commandment, one of them saying, "Thou shalt bring a daughter into the world." And as the frog foretold, so it happened. And the queen bore a daughter so beautiful that the king could not contain himself for joy, and he ordained a great feast. So it's like a birthday party, right? Not only did he bid to his relations, friends, and acquaintances, but also the wise women, that they might be kind and favorable to the child. So we've got the king, we've got the queen, and we have wise women. And of course, a baby. And since there's a fusion of paganism and Christianity that runs throughout these German stories, what number of wise women would you guess? If it was Christian, you should guess 3 or 7, right? But no, there are 13, which is a sacred number for pagans. There were 13 of the women in his kingdom, but as he had only provided 12 golden plates for them to eat from, one of them had to be left out. So here we have the father inviting the wise women and only supplying 12 plates. And because he only has 12 plates, and they're made of gold, but if you're the king, couldn't you make a 13th? No, he has to go to 12. And so one is left out. One never wants to mess with wise women, whether they're the 3 fates or whether they're the 13 in this story. However, the feast was celebrated with all splendor, and as it drew to an end, the wise women stood forward to present to the child their wonderful gifts. So, not only do they come to celebrate the birth of this child, they come with gifts. And the gifts I will list them out for you. One bestowed virtue. The other, beauty. A third, riches. And so on, whatever there is in the world to wish for. So they gave her all of the virtues plus some cash. And when the 11 of them had said their say, in came the uninvited guest, the 13th, burning to revenge herself, and without greeting or respect she cried out with a loud voice, in the 15th year of her age, the princess shall prick herself with a spindle and shall fall down dead. Okay, so watch out for that unlucky 13th in the Christian tradition. In her 15th year, this baby is going to prick herself and fall down dead. And without speaking one more word, she turned away and left the hall. Now remember, only 11 have given their gifts so far before the 13th walked in. And so there's one more. Everyone was terrified at her saying when the 12th came forward, for she had not yet bestowed her gift, and though she could not do away with the evil prophecy, she could soften it. So she said, the princess shall not die, but fall into a deep sleep for 100 years. Can you imagine what your life would be like if you went to bed tonight or had an accident today and you were asleep for 100 years? When you came back, nobody would be here. No one you knew, none of your friends, none of your relatives. Everything would have changed. Can you imagine if somebody had fallen asleep 100 years ago in our present culture, and they came back and they saw jets, atomic bombs, they saw the internet, phones? 100 years ago, most people didn't have phones. I mean, people were getting them 100 years ago, but certainly not ones that you could just carry in your pocket, and certainly not supercomputers that we could carry in our pocket. So she could soften it, and she said she will not die, she'll just fall into a sleep for 100 years. And for some of us, when we're really exhausted, isn't that what we wish for? We wish for that long sleep. Now the king, being desirous, because the king loves this baby, being desirous of saving his child even from this misfortune, gave commandment that all the spindles in his kingdom should be burnt up. Spindles are used to make thread so that you can weave. The maiden grew up, adorned with all the gifts of the wise women. She was lovely, beautiful, right? She was modest. She was sweet. She was kind. And she was clever, which means smart. She's the whole package. That no one who saw her could help but love her. Everybody loves this child. It happened one day, she being already 15 years old, that the king and queen rode abroad, and the maiden was left behind in the castle. She wandered about. Okay, so it's her birthday somehow, and her parents leave, and she's home alone. Not like Macaulay Culkin Home Alone, but in a way, yeah. She wanders around the castle, and she wandered about in all the nooks and corners and into all the chambers and parlors as the fancy took her, till at last she came to an old tower. She climbed the narrow winding steps, which led to a little door with a rusty key sticking out of the lock. She turned the key, and the door opened, and there in the little room sat an old woman with a spindle, diligently spinning her flax. "Good day, mother," said the princess. "What are you doing?" "I am spinning," answered the old woman, nodding her head. "What thing is that twists around so briskly?" asked the maiden, and taking the spindle into her hand, she also began to spin. But no sooner had she touched it than the evil prophecy was fulfilled, and she pricked her finger on it. In that very moment, she fell back upon the bed that stood there. Luckily, there's a bed in your workspace, right? And she lay in a deep sleep. But this is the part that the 13th hadn't said. And this sleep fell upon the whole castle. The king and queen who had returned and were in the great hall fell asleep, and with them the whole court. The horses in their stalls, the dogs in the yard, the pigeons on the roof, the flies on the wall, the very fire that flicked on the hearth became still and slept like the rest. And the meat on the spit ceased roasting. And the cook, who was going to pull the scullion's hair for making a mistake he had made, let him go and went to sleep. And the wind ceased, and not a leaf fell from the trees about the castle. So one of the ideas I want you to think about with this story is the idea of what happens during our sleep. Sigmund Freud wrote about the idea, and then one of his proteges also wrote about it, the idea that sleep tells us things. Now, modern-day psychologists and physiologists will say that during our sleep, we store certain long-term memories. It's a time for our brain to unload and reboot. And we go through different levels of sleep, right? Certainly, I've never slept for 100 years, even if I look 100 years old, all right? But this story that was told hundreds and hundreds of years ago is very interested in the idea of sleep. Then round about the place, about the castle, there grew a hedge of thorns, thicker every year, until at last the whole castle was hidden from view, and nothing of it could be seen from the vane of the roof. Oh, except for the vane of the roof, which is just a wind vane that tells us, like a rooster, a wind vane on top of a place. And a rumor went abroad in all that country of the beautiful sleeping Rosamund. Finally, we find out what this beautiful, virtuous, sleeping beauty is named. And her name is Rosamund. Which Rosa means a rose, and Mond means a mountain, or it could also mean the world as well, but everything that's beautiful, right? So the story lets us know, since it introduced her name, for so the princess was called. And from time to time, many kings' sons, so princes, came and tried to force their way through the hedge, but it was impossible for them to do so, for the thorns held fast together like strong hands. And the young men were caught by them, and not being able to get free, died a lamentable death. So you have this whole facility, this whole palace surrounded by thorns and decorated by the bodies of all the princes who have tried to break in. Many a long years afterwards, there came a king's son into that country and heard an old man tell how there should be a castle standing behind the hedge of thorns, and that there was a beautiful, enchanted princess named Rosamund that had slept for 100 years, and with her the king and queen and the entire court. The old man had been told by his grandfather that many kings' sons had sought to pass the thorn hedge, but had been caught and pierced by the thorns, and had died a miserable death. Then said the young man, "Nevertheless, I do not fear to try. I shall win through and see the lovely Rosamund." The good old man tried to dissuade him, but the young prince would not listen to his words. For now, the 100 years were at the end, and the day had come when Rosamund should be wakened. When the prince drew near the hedge of thorns, it was changed into a hedge of beautiful large flowers, which parted and bent aside to let him pass, and then closed behind him in a thick hedge. When he reached the castle yard, he saw the horses and brindled hunting dogs lying asleep, and on the roof the pigeons were sitting with their heads under their wings. And when he came indoors, the flies on the wall were asleep. The cook in the kitchen had his hand uplifted to strike the scullion, and the kitchen maid had the black fowl on her lap, ready to pluck. Then he mounted higher, and saw in the hall the whole court lying asleep, and above them on their thrones sat the king and queen. And still he went further, and all was so quiet that he could hear his own breathing. Now he's not Darth Vader. It wasn't like... But have you ever been in a building that's completely empty and all you can hear is your own heartbeat and your own breath? Or your own house? That could happen, right? At last he came to the tower, and he went up the winding stair and opened the door of the little room where Rosamund lay. And when he saw her looking so lovely in her sleep, he could not turn away his eyes. All right. Now, in modern day parlance, what would we call someone who spies on you in your sleep? If a stalker comes to mind, that might be it. All right. So, and presently he stooped and he kissed her, and she awaked and she opened her eyes and looked very kindly on him. All right. So how old would the prince be? Back in the Middle Ages, when these stories were composed, it would be normal for a man to wait until about 29 or 30 to get married. On the other hand, weddings were arranged all the time, so probably he's in his teens. She was 15 when she fell asleep, so she's 115 now, right? He stooped and kissed her, and she awaked and opened her eyes and looked very kindly on him. And she rose, and they went forth together. The king and the queen, the whole court waked up and gazed on each other with great eyes of wonderment. And the horses in the yard got up and shook themselves. The hounds sprang up and wagged their tails. The pigeons on the roof drew their heads from under their wings, looked around and flew into the field. The flies on the wall crept on a little farther. The kitchen fire leapt up and blazed and cooked the meat. The joint on the spit began to roast. The cook gave the scullion such a box on the ear that he whirred out, and the maid went on plucking the fowl. Then the wedding of the prince and Rosamund was held with all splendor, and they lived very happily together until their lives' end. Structurally, what is wrong with this story? All stories need to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. All stories also need to have conflict. Stories typically have a hero And stories typically have, let's see if one of my black markers will work. And it does not work. And a villain. Now in the story, we have a conflict. And what is the conflict? Well, Dad didn't invite the 13th wise woman over to the birthday party for the child. Probably her first birthday, right? And so she gave out a curse. And then the 12th one said, oh, but her curse will only last for 100 years. So really, the father starts the conflict by being impolite. The 13th wise woman who is snubbed comes along, takes offense, and delivers the curse. This story, though, has a beginning, but then the middle is sleep. Cows are asleep, horses are asleep, flies on the wall are asleep, people plucking food, people cooking food, people hitting each other, they're all asleep. Nothing can happen while you're sleeping in the sense of action moving forward, unless you're having a very vivid dream. But what do we want in all stories to happen? We want the villain to have a comeuppance, to be punished, for there to be some sort of restoration of justice. But instead, you have a 115-year-old woman, a 15-year-old girl, waking up after a dude kisses her while she's asleep, saying, oh, I love you, let's get married. And the end. And everyone wakes up. Dreams are weird things. Have any of you had dreams where you're being very kind or nice or generous with a person who you really loathe, and you wake up, or kiss them even, and you wake up thinking, I have to go wash my mouth out now? Our minds work very strangely, even after we've studied them for all these years. But there is no resolution to the story. She goes to sleep, and she wakes up. And nothing happens in between. That's why this story is very unsatisfying. It's structurally deficient. So think about Rosamond going to sleep. Think about the idea of women being most beautiful when they're asleep. And think about the idea of misogyny, hatred of women. What can't women do when they're asleep? Or what aren't they doing? They're not talking. They're just laying there. They're passive. I think the story is disturbing. I think it's unsatisfying. I think that what we want as readers or listeners is to find out how the villain, the 13th, got punished. But there is no punishment. There's no justice. And frankly, if a stranger came to you while you were sleeping and kissed you on the lips, would your reaction be to say, I love you, let's get married? Not mine. Not mine. I'd be freaked out. So this is a story of Sleeping Beauty in the original form. I hope you enjoyed. Thank you very much.